UMassOnline, doing a workshop on creating connections to openness.
Thank you. So yeah, everyone's awake. So just in case that didn't wake up, I thought I'd start off with a test. All right. Anyone know who that is? Come on, everyone here cites him all the time. So it's Brian Behlendorf, the co-founder of Apache. Anyone know who that is? No? Boy. So that's the lead contributor to the Apache project. He's involved in several, Bill Rowe is involved in several projects. How about this? Everyone's got to know this guy. I've seen this guy mentioned, or his work mentioned, in almost every session I've been to. Who? No? No. Anyone? But you get at least a point for speaking up. Let's make this easy. So you're feeling a little apprehensive about participating. How many people here, raise your hand if you attended this CIT? Raise your hand. So now you should all be comfortable about participating. All right? Jimmy Wales? Oh, yeah. It's easy now that I put the answer up there. All right, here's the tough one. How's this? Do you know who this is?
Winston Churchill's younger brother.
Again, a point, whoever said that. This is the leading contributor to Wikipedia. He's made, Justin Knapp has made almost 900,000 contributions to Wikipedia. All right, everyone knows this is the easiest one.
Yes.
Give a little hint back here, so you people sitting in the back can see, right? Who? Anyone?
Martin should be on.
All right, there's one. Okay, Smarty Pants. Who's this? You should be getting a theme about now, right?
Is that you a few years ago?
Yeah. Tim Hunt. He's the leading non-Moodle employee contributor to Moodle. All right. University of South Africa. All right, so I'm Pat Masson, and I had to come up with a name to tie it into. I need to start off by thanking Greg Ketchum, who's not here, but I'll say on TV. Hi, Greg. I think he got drunk at EDUCAUSE, and before he realized what he was doing, he asked me to present here. He's on the CIT planning board. So I thought I was sort of struggling with the title. So creating connections through openness, or is it creating openness through connections? And what I'd like to do, if you'll notice in the lower right-hand corner, the reason you didn't see me at lunch, and I'm sure you're looking, was that I took George Siemens' presentation and I mapped it to my presentation and trying to build on this idea of connections. When you see that slide down there, I made my own connection as I was watching his presentation, and I thought it might be interesting if you had that reference point, maybe make your own connection about what he was talking about and some of the concepts that I'll be talking about. And maybe not, and maybe it's just a distraction. But either way, you'll be thinking about it. So what I wanted to get to, the point here, some of these things might strike you as odd, and I want to basically touch on how I think most people agree with the first point, that open methods are now seen as a feasible and viable toward the creation, development of educational resources. The next one, people might sort of scratch their head. We don't need any more open initiatives, which is going to be sounding strange from the chair of the EDUCAUSE Openness Constituent Group and board member of JSIG, which is a open source community. But the lessons learned, next point I hope we take away is that the lessons learned from open source communities provide an excellent reference implementation. The history of what open source software development went through, I think, can be applied to OER. And when I say OER, I mean a broader term than, I think anything that we use as a resource in education. So there might, I know that there's discussion that OER is a specific set of learning objects or activities that are distributed to folks, but I'm using it in a broader sense. And finally, agile principles, which we'll talk a little bit about. And if you went to Clark Shaw Nelson's presentation, you got a little taste of this, about how agile methods can actually promote good practice within open communities, not only for the individual or the community, but also an assessment to measure the health and the openness of that particular community. So I want to start back in time. Anybody want another test? Back in 2004 was the last time CIT was here, And the person who gave the keynote then was Philip Long. And he was at MIT, and he was involved with OpenCourseware, Open Knowledge Initiative, lots of the open initiatives around software and OpenCourseware and open communities. And he talked a lot about how the 1990s, everything was coming online, and we were moving to transactions online. It wasn't just the lookup, it was sort of the emergence of the Web 2.0 and being able to engage more deeply in the internet and tools and that platform provided. And he was pointing to the 2000s, so this was in 2004, that we're going to move to the O decade. And his title was The Story of O. And he talked about how he foresaw the development of open systems, tools, archives, a lot of the stuff that we're sort of been talking about today. So it's interesting, sort of the serendipity of these two events. And please, again, notice the slides on the bottom. People in the back, you should have bought better tickets. So you can see these. Should have come at the top. And these were the concepts that he was talking about and around openness and applying what he'd seen in open source development, open source projects, and the value proposition that they offer for other open initiatives. And there's a bunch of stuff in there. And I asked permission to, and he was actually, to grab this stuff. And these were sort of the main concepts. Again, pointing back to the talk this morning, I grabbed one, ideas should freely spread from one to another. Talk about networks and the connections between ideas and how they promote new concepts and better understanding. Then there's this other side of open source that's sort of the advocacy of adoption and the proselytizing and sort of this this is Richard Stallman for folks who's a Free Software Foundation. And he had it's interesting that this was in Moscow, that if you read the quote there, but he's talking about the liberation of technology and how it's going to free people, it's going to allow, what we see with, you could say, with the uprising in Egypt and the Arab Spring, the use of technology, unofficial communication channels that have spread ideas and so on. So, but he came off a little creepy. That's on tape, so I hope I don't get in trouble. But there was this promise of what open source would be.
First thing I'd like you to do is a little thought experiment. Imagine taking all the world, everybody imagine books, and imagine just tearing out the pages. So liberating these pages, and imagine digitizing them, right? And then storing them in a vast, interconnected global repository. Think of it as a massive iTunes, right, for book-type content. Okay? And then take that material and imagine making it all open so that people can modify it, play with it, improve it. Imagine making it free so that anyone in the world can have access to all of this knowledge. And imagine using information technology so that you can update this content, improve it, play with it on a time scale that's more on the order of seconds instead of years. Okay? Instead of the editions coming out every 2 years of a book, imagine it coming out every 25 seconds. Okay? So imagine we could do that, and imagine we could put people into this, right? So that we could truly build an ecosystem with not just authors, but all the people who could be or want to be authors in all the different languages of the world. And I think if you could do this, it would be called, well, I'm just going to refer to it as a knowledge ecosystem. Okay, so really...
All right, so that's the founder of Connections, Richard Barry. But, and that guy's not as weird as Richard Stallman, right? So, but these are the comments that if you, the barriers to adoption of open source and open initiatives, specifically open source, and this is collected from various comments over the last 10 years, and there are many more, but I thought these were particularly good, from the EDUCAUSE CIO constituent group. So we have the technology divisions, departments on campuses, and this is sort of the discussions that are going on around open source. And there are really two questions, feasibility and viability. So is this product feasible? Is it something that we can use? Does it meet the functional requirements? Is it going to perform as we expect? Is this a candidate for the solution? The other was the viability of the community. Well, comments you'd hear is, well, what are you going to do when the guy dies? The guy that's in the basement, there's a guy shaking his head. He must have heard this 1 or 2 times. Or maybe he's the guy.
Clark was mentioning yesterday about somebody getting hit by a bus.
Right.
Thumbs in the wind.
And we have that hacker culture mentality of this some open source group. And how do you measure the community and whether or not it's going to provide that continuity so that the next release comes out, so the bugs are fixed, and what about training materials and so on. However, adoption of open projects seem to be increasing. So there's the introduction of open content and open educational resources, open science, and so on. And if you go today and look on EDUCAUSE, you can see there's plenty of open initiatives that have somehow permeated higher education. And we're all here, and we've been talking about it. So apparently there's been some success in that. And all of this was based on the idea of openness as described in the open source software movement. And so David Wiley, when he explains how he came to create, at the time it was called Open Learning, but has now become OER, Open Educational Resources, he referenced the open source model. And guess what? I think it's fair to say we've won, whoever we are, right? You know, so we can all pat ourselves on the back. And Microsoft, who once called Linux a cancer, is now the 17th leading contributor to the Linux desktop. And we all know the news. Okay, everyone has to tell a joke that came in now. I'm serious. So Blackboard's announcement, I'm sure, which everyone has had time to formulate their own opinions, has now embraced open source as both a feasible and viable option for online education. And recently, the New Medium Consortium just said the number 5 meta trend for the next 10 years is going to be openness. So apparently we are, you know, I haven't seen anyone officially say it, but I don't know who that person would be. So I'll step up and say it. Apparently open source or openness is a viable option for us as we move forward as a developed methodology. Good. I'm pointing me to leave. And in fact, referencing the previous speaker, there's Open SUNY. And I'm not in SUNY anymore, so I have the freedom to speak as an outsider. And so we have the Open SUNY project, which I think is excellent, and the idea of trying to create more connections. And this Chancellor Zippers put this out, and she was upset that, not upset, but she was wondering why Systemness wasn't in Wikipedia. So working within the open ecosystem, I went ahead and created a Systemness page for her. And I hope through the Open SUNY initiative, many of you will now go onto the Systemness. And I've kept it as neutral as possible without putting any opinions in. And I'm not saying that they're good or bad, but you know, through the spirit of openness, I invite you all to participate. Maybe that guy with 900,000 links will do it. So we have all these projects that are successful, and so we don't need any more open projects. I'll let that sink in. What we need is more participation in the open initiatives that are already out there. All right, please reference George's slide if you haven't been following along. So here's an example. Here are 40 open source learning management systems. How many folks here went through an LMS review within the last 3 years? Come on, everyone. You're all in SUNY, right? Didn't SUNY just go through a big LMS? So recently, MITx announced that they're coming out with a new platform that'll be deliver their open courseware, and they announced also they'll be developing a new open source learning management system. And I wonder why, with more than 40 different open source LMSs out there, we need to take that money, that intelligence, that effort, and we're going to now spend it on replicating what's already been done. There must be one of these that can serve as a foundation for what they're doing. And just to prove that this was mine that I did back in 2000. It was called the Instructional Improvement Courseware. And let me tell you, the faculty did not like having to work in something that said that their courses need to be improved. So it wasn't really popular. But I put it in there because I want to eat my own dog food. So that's the open source LMS environment. Now we have, I went out and I'm a developer in previous lives. And I went out and found out how many object-oriented programming classes can I find in OpenCourseware initiatives. So I'm not going to go through all. I tried to smush them together. So here's some from Merlot, 3 on the right. Here's some from Connections. Here's 3 of them from MIT, and here's one from Stanford. Here's from the Open University UK. I wanted to give you time to sort of take in the slides at the bottom. And we have all of these new OER OC.U groups. So I'm waiting to see SUNY Open or Open SUNY on here, right? And again, pointing down to the slide, George was talking about the fragmentation of learning. So I wonder what kind of fragmentation is happening, or replication of content is happening across these multiple systems. And I'm sure you guys know even more. So, you guys see? Whoops, I'm blocking things. So one of the problems is we have all of these systems and all of these consortia, and one of the problems, which the previous video of Richard Baranek was talking about from Rice, is now he's saying we've got so many of these. And you could be a cynic and say, well, of course he's saying that because he wants everyone to be in connections. But I think that there is some truth to, we all have these open initiatives. And we've got, everyone's better for some reason. So, one is more open, with more open flavor, or whatever it might be. And that often open education proponents focus on the idea of instructors sharing their resources, right? The idea is we want to have faculty who are willing to share their resources, make them available. We talk about alternatives to publishing models. What we don't talk a lot about is using those, adopting those. Instead of me making all my great stuff available, how many folks are actually using that great stuff? And do we have an ecosystem that was talked about before, a network, connections, to allow for people to find that information, use it, and value it, when often the creating of content is tied to other incentives or other parts of your position on campus. So Ellen Marie Murphy made a post to the Openness constituent group, announced sharing the news that Washington State had adopted legislation groundbreaking in higher education for open textbooks. And I saw that, and so I threw a question out. It seems like this was prefaced with, I think it was actually a snow day, so I was pretty bitter. So I was snarky, and I said, it seems like we're getting a lot of announcements of these new initiatives. What's going on with people, like I just said, pulling these into their courses, using these? And 2 responses, I think, are 2 credible responses from Cable Green and David Wiley, and they both agreed that we're not seeing the type of engagement in terms of the user base. We're seeing a lot of publishing, a lot of organizations that are creating these initiatives, but we're not seeing the level of adoption of these resources that, that's sort of the promise of why we're doing this. A while back, George Stevens tweeted a comment pointing to a blog post by Mark Taylor out of Columbia, talking about how competition and tying this into sort of this competitive environment between campuses. So we have this competition where campuses are trying to remain, maybe there's a little threat of online learning, maybe there's a little threat from traditional publishing houses, maybe there's a little threat from the geographically bound student who now can take a course anywhere. And so last year at EDUCAUSE, and this is an older blog post, but the term open washing was very popular due to some of the recent announcements, recent announcements from a couple of the publishers and LMS developers. So I think open has somewhat become organic, light, green, cloud. There's sort of these tools that might be sort of advantageous to tie to your brand in order to capture some of the excitement and of openness or open or the actions, the activity, and a lot of it's good work, don't get me wrong. But how do you measure authenticity? And there's a financial benefit for this. New Hampshire just passed legislation requiring state agencies to look at open source tools. Washington, Massachusetts, Washington previously mentioned. Massachusetts has a policy on the assessment of open source tools. The UK has a long-standing, since 2004, and actually a toolkit to go in and see whether or not this is really open. There's other countries, Iceland, obviously UNESCO is very interested in this and is promoting this as policy and working with governments to increase adoption of open resources. There's funding and grants. So we all know about the NIH. I think that came out in a few sessions. The U.S. State Department and Labor Department are both tying open access and the use of open source or open source tools in procurement. So there's all sorts of examples. So there might be, I'm just saying, there might be some incentive for me to promote my openness when I'm applying for a grant, or I'm part of a program, or I'm being assessed by a university or a government agency, department that's required to look at open source tools. So here's a question. I'm just asking. I don't know. You familiar with these groups? So Blackboard's Open Services, Moodle Room's Joule, RSmart's got a flavor of Sakai. Instructure proudly promotes their work with open source. Open Class from Pearson. How do we know if these groups are open? And what does that mean in terms of expectations, both as a partner to these groups and how it affects the institution that might be partnering with them? I think openness needs to be focused on, rather than, let me get ahead of myself here. I think we're shifting from a consumer-based economy to a prosumer-based economy. And so the idea with open source and open educational resources is that you have all these materials available, and you will influence their future development. So how many folks here know what version of Google they're running? I mean, you guys use it every day. You must know what version you're running, right? Well, there's no version, right? And what happens is there's a slow versionlessness deployment of new tools. And they use analytics to assess how people are using them. And if it's something people seem to be self-organizing around, they enhance that. And if there's something that seems to be dying off, they get rid of that. Sort of like Wave, you know, that was a big example. But how many times have you gone to Google and see a new little widget? That's not a big, oh, I need to get training on the plus button now. It's just something that's there, and you sort of grow into it. And if it's something that other people are interested in, they expand it. And if not, they let it die on the vine and fade away. Everyone's iPhone is actually different. Your apps and my apps are not the same. So we've created our own device. There's a platform for it, but the functionality that's there is as unique, probably, as we all are as individuals on our iPhones. So we're taking something, we're mashing it up or customizing it, and the way we interact with it is influencing further development. When something gets downloaded 1 million times on the iStore, they know it, and the developers who develop it know it, and they know that this is something they'll continue to invest in. So here's an example of a real practical prosumerism, or real practical prosumerism in place. Anyone from UC Irvine here? All right. What year? So Irvine came out, opened up in the 60s. And you can tell this is a picture of Southern California because there are no housing complexes around it. There's open space in Southern California, which I'm from San Diego originally, and I was at UCLA, so I can take it from me, there's no space like this. So this was when Irvine first was opened up. And you can see what they did is they just built the buildings around the quad, and they didn't put any pathways, walkways in it. And what they decided to do, so let me zoom in on that for you, they let people just walk from building to building, and they got all these organic paths. Right? Because they didn't know how many people were going to go from the parking lot to the, who knows. So then once they had these cow paths defined, they just paved them. So here's a modern picture. So the community was involved in the design, offering rapid feedback for the future development of walkways at Irvine. So that's prosumerism. What we're seeing now in our space is a shift from local, hierarchical, and centralized organizations to remote, distributed, and decentralized. So rather than having all the all the systems hosted locally at our data center, right, many of the systems we're accessing are off-site, and that might be formalized through a service, a software as a service, or ASP, or cloud service, but we're not controlling that anymore. The decision-making around those services isn't controlled by the CIO or the cabinet or anything like that. The decision-making is distributed amongst all the people that are using it in that prosumer model. And we're no longer centralized in development, meaning that we're not paying directly for those resources that develop it. Who's developing Moodle? We saw the list of all the people that are contributing to Moodle, and they're distributed around the world, and they don't all report to the same people. And so what we have in this model is remote, distributed, decentralized references, tools, and services. So references are just things like documents that you reference. And go look at this PDF, go look at this web page, go look at this movie. Tools are things where we might send students out of the LMS and to go undertake some activity. Go watch this video, go blog. And then services are under the hood. So RSS feeds is a good example. Or mashups that you might embed in your LMS. The processing occurs somewhere else, but the results are piped back to the LMS. So at UMassOnline, there was a debate on whether this was really happening, a discussion of whether or not the LMS was the end-all platform. All your teaching and learning can take place using those tools within the environment. So we looked at 40,000 courses over 3 years and found over 420,000 unique URLs, basically integration points, where a faculty member or student had created a link out to some, again, third-party resource, reference, service, tool. And those 420,000 pointed out to nearly 20,000 unique domains. So, out to Barnes & Noble, who's our sponsors, out to Pearson, out to, I don't know, whoever people are at the, get the plug in for them. So YouTube, and these are all external links. So there's no way, I believe, that any software developer, whether it's an open source methodology or a commercial platform, is going to be able to create 20,000 unique, or 20,000 tools to satisfy apparently what are the teaching and learning requirements for the folks, at least at UMass. Maybe SUNY's different, I don't know. And what it resulted in is Chris Anderson's long tail. So the majority of everyone used some tools. Great, I don't know, we have a streaming media server. And so there are a lot of folks that pointed out to that. Pearson's and their EPUB, there are a lot of those. But then on a long tail here, there's 1 or 2 courses that use unique niche tools. There's somebody who's got a star chart, and there's somebody who's got a graphics calculator, and there's someone who's got a graphics annotation tool, and they point out there, and they're the only ones that's using it, they found it. And the LMS companies have seemed to recognize this. So we've got more and more distributed, remote, and decentralized integration for those types of services. So you've got the building blocks, you've also got extensions, you've even got a Blackboard open source group that creates modules or tools for building blocks. Desire to Learn has their own community of developers for enhancing the platform. Obviously it makes sense for Moodle, Sakai, and Canvas. They're open source, so they're obviously looking for co-developers. And there's also another player in this, is the third-party tools themselves. So LTI, which is Learning Tool Interoperability, which is a standard developed by the IMS Global Learning Consortium, allows for an interface that almost provides plug-and-play access for third-party tools. So there's a Twitter, TED-Ed, WordPress. So basically it extends the platform of the LMS using the LTI integration. And it's adopted by, I don't know if you can see all the logos here, pretty much everybody. So it's a standard that you can build to. if you're developing a third-party tool, you want to have it integrated. And then there's Google Gadgets, and so on.
Hi, I'm Joe Berkowitz, president of NoteFlight. NoteFlight is a company that has created the first online browser-based music composition and arranging software. And this software is particularly potent in an educational setting, where it can be combined with online course management systems and curriculum delivery systems. So one of the challenges we faced is how to tie NoteFlight together with the various systems in use on campuses and schools across the world. And fortunately for us, the IMS Global Learning Consortium has now introduced a global standard for tying together external tools, such as NoteFlight, that are web-based, with these learning management systems. So in this demonstration, I'm going to show you how a teacher can create a simple composition activity in NoteFlight and tie that into a course in a learning management system, and we're going to use Moodle as the example. The student will then do some work on that activity, and the teacher will have an opportunity to examine it and mark it up and comment on it. So let's move on to the concrete demonstration. So here we are as the instructor looking at a course outline in the learning management system. And we've decided to add a new NoteFlight activity to the course. So that entails supplying a name for the link that will take us to that activity or take the student there, and supplying a prompt for the activity. And now we've created that link, and we're going to look at it. NoteFlight appears in a separate frame inside the learning management system. And the first thing we have to do is make the score, the musical score, that's going to constitute this activity. This score is an activity template in NoteFlight, which means that each student will get their own copy of that template to work on. And the nature of this activity is that each student is going to compose 2 bars of their own to complete a 2-bar melody that the instructor creates here, as you see. NoteFlight is a notation editor that runs in a browser, and that's what you're seeing here is the creation of some notated music. So the instructor simply saves the score and clicks a link that says, attach this page to link finish this melody. Now that makes this page, or this score, in NoteFlight's case, the destination of the link coming out of the learning management system. And using basic LTI, it's possible to do this with no cutting and pasting of URLs or anything like that. It's very clean. Now we'll log in as the student. And the student accesses the same course, and they click the link that the instructor created before. Now they're taken straight to the score that the instructor created. Thanks to NoteFlight, however, this is actually a copy of the instructor's original document, which the student will change by adding their own melody to. So the student saves their document, and we're going to log in one more time as the instructor and see how the instructor can access the work the student carried out. Now some of that work is done by basic LTI. Again, the instructor clicks the link, which takes them to the template for the activity that they created. But NoteFlight has recorded a list of all the student work associated with this template. So the instructor can now find that student's work, and here we are looking at the student's completion of that assignment, which the instructor can now listen to. And NoteFlight incorporates a set of annotation and markup tools, also versioning, so it's possible to have some nice workflow around student-teacher interaction.
So we mentioned one of the benefits there was that, here's another example, that there was no cut and pasting of a link. Anyone see any other benefits that didn't happen? So hard to see what didn't happen, right? There's no second login. The authentication and authorization was passed directly through the LMS. So once the account was set up and it's connected, students didn't have to log in again. That was LTI Basic. They now have the next version, which allows for passing of grades and assignments, so that if you completed that, and that was there was a selective release, or you could only release or get to the next module or whatever it might be. So it's got greater functionality. So so we have one music and dance professor here. Out of many folks who probably don't teach that. So the tipping point for including a composing tool in an LMS is probably pretty high, and Blackboard, Moodle, Sakai, Canvas, they're probably not going to do it. So you are never going to have this tool unless you provide one of those links. Go out, now you become a system administrator and a help desk and all the rest of it, because you have to manage this tool separately. So this is becoming a more common interface, and whether that's through building blocks or Angel Nuggets or Moodle modules or Sakai gadgets, we're doing that. So I want to use NoFlight. How do I know if they're going to be there? How do I know if they're going to put the next bug out? They say they're open. What does that mean? Unfortunately, I think open has become, has focused on licensing, around distribution and acquisition, publishing. It's often referred to, I think, more that way than it is what it should be, is a development methodology. So EDUCAUSE and Wikipedia both provide some definitions of openness. And the Wikipedia example, I think, is important because it talks about the organizational behavior that's required for openness. It doesn't talk about licensing. It talks more about how to engage with users and the value associated with that, and how an organization should behave in order to promote that. In addition, how many times have we all been to a presentation about the latest adoption of the open source tool, Moodle or Sakai or uPortal or whatever it might be, and inevitably somebody talks about, oh, we saved money, right? Isn't that a primary driver? So unfortunately, highlighting only the fact that it reduces their total cost of ownership sort of takes away from all the other benefits of using open source. So pace of development. Remember the introduction to Connections talked about the rapid production of publications. If you shared it with lots of folks, they would see problems. They'd be able to fix them, or they'd make contributions, or it would spark new ideas, like George Siemens said this morning. You can assess the quality of the code or the documentation, and then the organization is all transparent. You can measure the health of that organization. Is it really one guy in a basement, or is it a whole group of folks? Is it 4 campuses working together? So there's all these different values and benefits from openness that come from open source software, and I think also apply to open educational resources or open resources in general. But we often overlook them for the last one there, total cost of ownership, which is actually cumulative of all of this. You only see that true total cost savings if you work in an environment that allows for all of these attributes. So there's a lot of ambiguity. I went to Empire State's presentation on open education and a study group approach to understanding it, and they asked, how do you define open? And I took some notes. Well, it's free. There's no charge. It's free access, ability to edit. You can change it. You can once you have that access, you can do some changing. It's a free education, somebody said. And then my favorite one is, well, there's no accountability. And so it's just out there, and we don't know what's going to happen. Maybe I'm mischaracterizing that. This was also mentioned. Today, I think Lisa Stevens pointed to this. So these are David Wiley and Cable Green's definition of open, and what the requirements are for something to be open. You should be able to do these things: revise, remix, reuse, and redistribute. Questions? This is the crazy guy, Richard Stallman, the guy with the beard. So he started the Free Software Foundation. And his perspective on open, and if there's any purists in here, we can have the discussion about the animosity between, or not animosity, but the debate over free versus open. But for general terms, in order for something to be maybe FLOSS, free, Libre, open source software, these are the characteristics that he would prescribe to an organization that claims to provide free or open software. And this is the open source initiative's requirements for calling yourself open. I have all these slides online, so you don't have to read them now. And it includes social context around non-discrimination and so on, so it's even broader. And I want to go back to when David Wiley talked about open learning in 2001, I think it was actually. But he pointed back to 1998 when the open source label was created, and he wanted again to capture that same development approach, that same methodology to developing content. So I think it's important that we look at what the open source label is. It was branded on February 3rd, and Chris Peterson came up with the idea because they wanted to get rid of that sort of free and hippie love sort of, man, it'll just all work out, we should share, and it'll all take care of itself connotation with free software. And also that the only value was derived from the fact that it was freely, there's no cost to it. And they came on that after a recommendation from Eric Raymond, who wrote the Cathedral and the Bazaar. I hope everybody has read this, if you're interested in open anything. And it's a book about the difference between traditional development methodologies, which he likens to the cathedral, building a cathedral, where you have these knowledgeable folks who direct, and there's a master plan, compared to a bazaar, which is sort of free form, and folks come in and find a place and to sit, and it might be next to this person, and next week it's somewhere else, and they might not come back because they didn't sell enough stuff. But a bazaar is there, and it seems to work. And he was influenced by Linus Torvalds' development of Linux. And he recognized a new way of understanding, or describes a new way of understanding the folk practices of the hacker community. And that's not the negative, like the cracker community. The hacker community, hacker's been turned into this word as like, you know, the evil sneak into your bank account thing. This is the programmer community that he described. And specifically distributed peer review. And what it came up with is what's called Linus's Law. This is Eric Raymond and Linus Torvalds. And Eric Raymond described it as given enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow. Meaning that if you have enough, it's twofold. Meaning that if you have enough people looking at this, someone will find the problem, which is half the problem. Or, yeah, half the problem. And then someone else might come up with the solution. So the methodology and again, this is applicable, the methodology is applicable to what we're seeing in content development, coursewares, and so on. The idea is that the product benefits from the property or the methodology associated with open source. So again, you don't have to read all these. So in the book, he goes through some observations that he's made about why and how open source communities work and the benefits for them. So every good work of software starts by scratching a developer's personal itch. So if you're an economics professor, if you're a music and dance professor, and you have an affinity, or that's your passion, you're going to care about note flight, right? And that's good, and now when you get involved with the community, you're going to go out and find relevant content. You're going to find problems with that. You're an expert. You'll be able to contribute that back. All right? Don't try to be, the enemy of good is perfect. We don't want to have everybody do everything. Find something that you're interested in and that's important to you and contribute. It's just a ton of like great little fortune cookie type things that you can put in there. Like good programmers know what to write, great ones know what to reuse and rewrite. plan to throw one away. If you have the right attitude, interesting problems will fall into. But the idea is about participation. The same idea is around prosumership. So Eric Raymond, who has the seminal work around open source communities and development, was later influenced by the Agile project management or Agile software development movement. And he wrote a paper showing that the same qualities that the practices that he saw happening in open source communities could be articulated as the principles in the Agile Manifesto. So like every good movement, you have to have a manifesto. And so if you want to look up if you want to look up the Agile Manifesto, it's got some basic ideas around how communities should work. And these are the principles and values that I would look at when I'm assessing whether or not an open community, whether that's for OER or open source, if they adhere to these principles, not practices, but principles, then I think that's a healthy indication, or that's a good indication of how healthy the community is. And again, these are online. But fundamental to the Agile principles is the concept of develop at the same pace your users can articulate need. And that's Jim Highsmith, who's one of the Agile Manifesto signatories. And the idea is that you do just enough. It's iterative incremental development. So if you're writing a textbook or creating an open courseware course, just put out there, just like I did with systemness on Wikipedia, and that's how Wikipedia works. Just put enough out there, and it just becomes a tag. And the next time somebody comes in, they're going to say, systemness, is that like truthiness? And they're going to go in there and they're going to add their comments. And then and it grows. And it's always useful because it's providing new information, but it represents the collective understanding and knowledge of that topic. Same with your course. Same with an open source project. There are several attempts at creating an open source maturity model. These are some of them. And of particular interest to me is one of them. And what it does is it looks for artifacts that are present within the community. And I would say that all of these artifacts are informed by the Agile principles. So develop at the same pace of users can articulate needs. Yeah, your documentation might be poor. Your course might not be that great. But do you have is it an artifact that somebody can reference? Is there, how many people have contributed to it? How many people have reviewed it? And so on. So as you build out these artifacts, and this is from a software context, but I think it's applicable to OER in general, these artifacts allow you to measure the maturity of the community, and thus the sustainability of the project. So I've turned this into sort of my own openness maturity model. And these sound like, you know, those posters like with the big whale tail, and it says perseverance, or I don't know why we wouldn't tell it. You know, it sort of sounds corny. But this is an attempt to provide both an individual set of guidelines, or it's really a causality sort of model. One thing leads to another, both for the organization and for individuals looking at an open source or choosing or wishing to participate in an open source community, but also ways to measure if that open source community is behaving this way. So courage sounds, like I said, a little touchy-feely. But you have to have courage to step into an organization and be willing to just put something out there. Hey, I think this would be a better way, a better approach for teaching math, or whatever it might be. And I'm not a faculty member, so excuse me. And you have to participate. You can make all sorts of comments and say, oh, we should do this, and we should do that. And you've got lots of courage standing on your soapbox, but what are you doing about it? And then you have to be honest. You have to say, was that the best idea? I published my book, my chapter, my paper, and do I have the honesty to say, yeah, well, maybe that, you know, my data isn't complete yet, but I want to get it out there, and I might look like a fool for not having this, or like George was saying, I haven't thought about a lot of these things, but these are concepts I'm thinking of, so I can't articulate them well yet, but I want to put them out there. And maturity, if somebody comes in and says, hey, here's a better way to do it, are you mature enough to say, yeah, you know, I'm not married to this, I don't have, you know, I'm not so invested in this that I can't look at your opinion and yeah, that's better, we'll change it that way. And so as you work through these, these are sort of the values of the participants, of the organization. These are the principles that need to be in place. You need to have some form of communication. Now, you can quibble about what's the best form of communication. I think a completely open wiki is the best form, where everybody can see everything. Because if you have just email, then you have closed channel communication. Because you want to create transparency. You want to let everyone know what you're doing, why you're doing it, and how. And then once you do that, you'll get all sorts of self-organizing groups that come in and say, hey, I didn't know you were doing this. I want to participate. And that self-organizing group not only coalesces around affinity projects, that they have personal note flight, for example, but they also are self-directed. They assign their own tasks. Anyone can hold any position. If you're interested in an open source product, ask yourself, can me or my organization be on the board or be the benevolent dictator, or what type of governance is possible in this organization? Because if you don't have that access, if it's not possible for the meritocracy, which is where we're getting, sorry I gotta come myself, then it's probably not truly open. Because the self-organizing groups will then lead to collaboration, which provide evidence-based decision-making, which leads to meritocracy. So the best decisions are the ones where the project goes forward. And that's exactly what Google does. The community self-organizes around tools. I don't use all Google tools, but the ones I do use, as I interact with them, help inform the direction of the development. These are objectives. You want to keep things simple. Like I said, the enemy of good is perfect. The enemy of good is perfect. Do just enough so that it shows intention, so that people can build onto it, recognize your effort. Out of that emergence, best ideas come out. Again, allowing for incremental development, small iterations. Allow for people through transparency to provide feedback. That's the analytics people have been talking about. Use that to inform further decision making. And then these are just some tools that we've used in open source projects, especially at JSIG, to allow for all of these things. So you sort of can go through and you can assess whether or not whatever open thing that you're interested in is open. And if you truly value the potential benefits of openness around rapid development, quality, and so on, then this will be a tool to help you determine that. So now my plug, and eating my own dog food, I started a project called 2398. There was some interest in it. People came around. I didn't want to make this like my own thing. So I went out and I ran this model, and JSIG was an excellent organization. JSIG is the open source community that's responsible for uPortal, Central Authentication Services, or CAS, the beadwork calendar, UMobile. So your campuses are probably using one of these. I know probably CAS for sure. Most everyone uses that. And so I took them this project and say, hey, I want to focus on my one thing, and how can I join a community? I like them. And so the 2398 project is devoted to understanding the qualities of openness and promoting them as a frame of reference for projects. So that was what I came here to tell you, and hopefully I did. And I want to thank everyone. Any questions? Yes?
So, in your role as a CTO,
I don't get to do any of this.
you don't get paid like a CTO. I mean, I think that
Is that good or bad? I don't know.
Well, I think it's probably a good thing since you're stating you're talking about open source, as opposed to, let's call it the overarching technology issues in running a campus. And I think that's the challenge a lot of us have with boots on the ground is how do you integrate when you don't really have control over the infrastructure? You know, and what kind of advocacy can be created, you know, to kind of overcome that? Because I think that's a lot of the challenge is when you try to integrate something that's open source, who do you talk to? How do you persuade them? And how do you integrate? I think that looking at the commitments Lydia just made to Blackboard, where's the advocacy? You know, to get them to crack open, you know, the shell a little bit and let these things in. And I really think that you're an anomaly in that regard compared to like, what my experience has been both in education and in business too. So it might shock you to know that
UMassOnline has entered into a long-term agreement with Blackboard, right? So if I'm this open source zealot, why did we do that? And I think openness, about going back to this, is I can tell you, I can defend our decision to go to Blackboard. In 2004, we bought a perpetual license from WebCT, and that license was purchased by Blackboard. They had to honor that. We contracted so that no matter what the flagship LMS is, that we don't have to pay for it. So there's a business case, which means I am open to any decision. I'm making the decisions based on evidence, the maritime, you know. We communicated this. We did a completely LPR process, was completely open. We allowed self-organizing groups. Anyone could participate. You can go to that site and you can find, if you look up UMassOnline LPR, we developed user stories to test functionality rather than feature tests so that we could do evidence-based decision making, which include financial analysis, architectural analysis. We're a 15-campus institution running on one instance, so we needed multi-tenancy to allow for each campus to have its own domain. We hired Unicon, which supports Moodle and Sakai, and they came out and did an architectural review and found that the cost of delivering a multi-tenant model is less with Blackboard Learn than it was for either Moodle or Sakai due to the issues with multi-tenancy. So the decision was made. I got a lot of emails from my open source friends who were not happy. But you have, so I would say that UMassOnline, hopefully the IT part of it, is open. So I'm not going to, Brian Stewart, a CIO at Athabasca, is absolutely on board, and he'll say it's about making the right decisions. It would be hypocritical for me to come up here and not be open to commercial options.
I think that's agreed, but I think that strategically, the path that you're following, is encouraging and fostering, that kind of environment. And I think that that's something that we need to look at more closely. I mean, I'm just speaking for myself here, but what does anybody else think? Besides me.
Do you agree with George Siemens' idea of locking into an LMS?
I don't, actually. I do think that I just went to the IMS GLC, Global Learning Consortium, developer, dev, common, whatever it's called. And they're talking about LTI and LIS, which is integration with the information systems and common cartridge. They're the standards body that comes up with all of those sorts of things. And they had all the Ray Henderson and Chris Vento from Cengage and Andy Sanauer from OpenClass and the Josh guy from Instructure Canvas, and who else? Somebody from McGraw-Hill. And they're all talking about how they no longer make LMSs. They make e-learning platforms, and it's a platform for integration. So I don't know what an LMS is anymore, because I can stand up Moodle or Sakai or Blackboard or whatever, and it's getting to the point where you can have so many third-party tools that the LMS itself, the native tools, aren't there anymore. So imagine if you had Noteflight and you had WordPress and you had all these other tools. That course might not be representative of the native functionality of the LMS. Penn State's architecture school, once you log in, the LMS serves as a provisioning students into their courses and sets up the courses. Once you log in, you go to Drupal. So I agree that we're going to move to a framework, but if we have true integration and interoperability through open interfaces, then when am I in an LMS and when am I not? Why can't I run Moodle and Sakai? And why can't I pull Moodle modules through LTI into Blackboard, Blackboard building blocks into Canvas, and so on? So I think we will. I think his point about the LMS becoming less of a sort of system and it becomes a platform for integration is true, but I don't think it'll lock you in, because if you look at the development that's going on, we want Collaborate to work with Moodle, to work with Canvas, we want Noteflight to work with all these tools. So I think exposing those interfaces is going to create a platform where the underlying framework is transparent to the user. That's my thought.
You think the Blackboard folks are okay with going down to that level? To incorporate business from other? It seems unlike their
That's what they're telling me. We can run Blackboard through our maturity model and see how open they are. They might not be very transparent in their real.
I think in that case they have to evolve in that direction. They want to evolve, because campuses are running very large programs like PeopleSoft or Banner, and that's where they're getting their customers. And if the campuses were running PeopleSoft, Banner, for just pick two big examples, say, well, no, you're not serving our needs, then what's Blackboard doing? So there's going to be, I think there's going to be a continued drive and evolution, and further, I think Siemens was kind of on the ball with using, what's his name, the normal science versus having some chaos. Chaos is driving this thing where there's a lot going on, a lot evolving, a lot of different software pieces are being put together on a lot of different platforms. Eventually it'll calm down until you get this next disruptive technology or the thing that kind of paradigm comes along. People start developing again. I haven't seen the end of it. I haven't seen the start of the next wave yet. So, let's see. Hang on and enjoy the ride.
Any other questions, comments, tomatoes? Well, thank you very much. And my last word is go please join something and don't start it.